Welcome to the Philosophy channel. In this episode, we will discuss paradigms and paradigm shifts. All right. So, as we begin this episode on paradigms and paradigm shifts, I want to say that the value of this, in my opinion, is primarily criteriological. I really feel as though this is a fundamental and essential idea, this notion of what is a paradigm and how do paradigm shifts come about. I really do think that it's important. I know there are some presentations on the internet about this, but I definitely wanted to do my own and wanted to provide this information so that, in my opinion, if you understand this information, it makes it much easier to think through the history of philosophy. All right, so as an overview, what sorts of things are we going to be looking at? We're going to look at this idea of normal science. Let's not get hung up on the word normal. This is the term that Thomas Kuhn uses in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And I think that, I'm sticking pretty close to that text. And so this is the term he uses. This is the term we're going to use. Paradigms and paradigm competition. It's important to recognize that there are competing paradigms and how to think about and understand competing paradigms. In regard to this, then, we're going to talk about the worldviews and methods of Ptolemy and Copernicus as examples of paradigms. And I think that, again, I'm following Kuhn here, but this is just so easy to understand that I find myself just constantly returning to it because it makes it much more comprehensible and easier to digest. So then we're going to look at incommensurability, which I think is an absolute key insight, something we must understand, and paradigm shifts. So incommensurability, by definition, can be traced to a hinge point. And I believe that understanding this, we could say, what are the criteria for a hinge point? And then treating hinge points as criteria. So in this criteriology, tremendously beneficial for thinking. So we can think about these hinge points as crossroads, or thinking of them as crossroads where an ontological either or exists. Now, you often hear me talk about beyond either or, but here is a case where we really benefit from a solid either or. So, for example, a choice can be found. So we're talking about paradigms and competing paradigms. We want to find where these competing paradigms, a hinge point between these competing paradigms, where they are incommensurable. We want to find at what point they are necessarily mutually exclusive. When we find those hinge points, it enables us to think about these paradigms in a much more fluid and easier way. So, does the sun revolve around the earth, or the earth revolve around the sun? Notice that it cannot be both. So this is an example of mutual exclusivity. This is an example of an either or. This is an example of the difference between Ptolemy and Copernicus in terms of their worldviews and paradigms. Okay. We're also going to look at scientific revolutions, paradigm shifts, and the shifting boundaries of what constitutes or what counts as normal science. We're going to look at the normal scientific tradition. We're going to look at worldviews, or what I'm referring to here as WMPFSS, which is a real mouthful. But ultimately, worldviews, methods, a problem field, or what constitutes a problem, what counts as a problem, and standards of solution. So we want to understand these and understand how these relate to paradigms. We're going to talk about a paradigm as a Gestalt. That's why we see the duck rabbit and the Necker cube on this slide. We're going to talk about a paradigms or a paradigm as a Gestalt of these WMPFSSs. So we could say something like the idea that a paradigm is a Gestalt of these worldviews, methods, problem fields, and standards of solution. That is congruent with a scientific theory as a Gestalt of facts or empirical evidence. So we'll see how this makes sense as we go forward. And we could say that theories come in paradigms, and paradigms can be incommensurable. This is where postmodernists shipwreck. The problem with the idea of a fruitful misunderstanding is that they are perpetrating misunderstandings within the wrong paradigm. So the idea is that we often find these philosophers or these people thinking in regard to theories, right? This is about theory. So if you're thinking in regard to theory, one of the ways we could talk about this is that it's very important to understand that theories come in paradigms. So if you want to call that a context, you could call it a context for now. So if a theory comes in a paradigm, then it is possible to discuss theories, it is possible to criticize theories, but if you understand the paradigm that the theory comes in, and you're able to discuss the paradigm, or you're able to criticize the paradigm, then you're able to deal with the theory at a much more primordial level. So this is one of the reasons why it's very important to understand paradigms and paradigm shifts. Okay. So what is normal science? Normal science may be understood as a kind of tradition. Specifically, whatever tradition is considered historically dominant. And every scientific tradition may be understood as being comprised of a worldview, methods, a problem field, and standards for solution. So these historically based, then, WMPFSSs are used to investigate and understand empirical evidence and facts, right? So you could say that from the worldview that the sun revolves around the earth, there is empirical evidence. We're standing out in the yard and we see the sun moving in the sky. So we've got some sensory perception, we've got some evidence, and we have a worldview then that accounts for that evidence. We account for that evidence in a Ptolemaic way by saying that the sun must be revolving around the earth. There are methods associated with that worldview. There are methods associated with how we account for the sun revolving around the earth. And there are certain problems that are associated with that worldview and that understanding. And those problems are considered genuine and real problems when you have that worldview and you use these methods. And so then they also include standards for solution, right? So when you take all of these WMPFSSs, you can recognize that they refer to a paradigm of normal science when the scientific community understands the truth of reality. This is one thing that we could be talking about, for example, or an accurate philosophy of cosmology or an accurate philosophical depiction of the cosmos. Then you could say something like, these are also historically based. All right, so we'll keep pushing, but the idea here is that when or whatever paradigm is dominant, that set of methods, worldviews, problem fields, standards of solutions, that is considered normal science at the time. All right, so when you consider different possible traditions, all with their own WMPFSSs, each WMPFSS associated with a scientific tradition may be understood as a paradigm. So that's what I just said on the other slide. Thus, paradigms may be understood as competing with one another, for the honor of being considered the present historical norm. That is, the normal scientific tradition. These competing paradigms may be compared and contrasted, for example, then in terms of their worldview, their methods, their problem fields, and their standards of solution for problems, for what they consider to be problems. Okay. So I really like this. I think that we're at a very high level of criteriological abstraction. All right. Worldviews and methods of Ptolemy and Copernicus as examples of paradigms. So we have the geocentric versus the heliocentric paradigm. Whichever paradigm is considered correct, it will have its own criteria, right? We talked about this initially. For example, if you are operating within the geocentric paradigm, then you understand the movement of the planets in the night sky differently than within the heliocentric paradigm. Similarly, the WMPFSSs change when there is a paradigm shift. Okay? I think this is all pretty straightforward so far. A little bit technical or cumbersome language, but I think it's pretty straightforward. Incommensurability and paradigm shifts. So because paradigms differ in terms of these WMPFSSs, paradigms competing to be considered the normal scientific tradition may be incommensurable. For example, does the sun revolve around the earth or does the earth revolve around the sun? It cannot be both. Thus, when examining a paradigm, it is possible to find the hinge point or crossroads regarding its WMPFSSs that reveal, or regarding the paradigms, WMPFSS, I should say that, the singular, that reveal where it is incommensurable with other paradigms or where it is incommensurable with a competing paradigm. Specifically then, taking the point of incommensurability between two competing paradigms as the focus allows us to think about paradigms in the context of mutual exclusivity. Very helpful. So now we're talking about scientific revolutions, paradigm shifts, and the shifting boundaries of what counts as normal science. So whenever a paradigm shift occurs, and the normal scientific tradition is constituted by the new paradigm's criteria, the shift constitutes a scientific revolution. A paradigm as a gestalt of a WMPFSS is congruent with the idea of a scientific theory as a gestalt of facts or empirical evidence. So the idea is that it's the same empirical evidence that we have when formulating the Ptolemaic worldview or the Ptolemaic paradigm is the same empirical evidence that we have when formulating the Copernican paradigm or the Copernican worldview. So that's why I'm saying that it's a gestalt, because the idea is that just like the Necker cube, it depends on how you look at the evidence, right? So you could say that a paradigm then is a gestalt of worldviews, methods, problem fields, and standards of solution. We can then speak of pre- and post-revolution paradigms, or we can then speak of pre- and post-revolution paradigms. It is important to recognize how paradigms are incommensurable with the paradigm of the normal scientific tradition in terms of their WMPFSSs. So because, for example, what counts as a problem in the context of one paradigm may not even be considered a problem to another. Theories come in paradigms, and paradigms can be incommensurable. Lastly, this is very important because paradigms differ in terms of their WMPFSSs. Misunderstandings regarding a theory cannot be considered necessarily fruitful, since the theory under consideration may operate with WMPFSSs FS's that are incommensurable with the normal scientific paradigm. This can be understood with or without invoking the normal scientific paradigm. So I really think that that's an important point. There are two really important points there. So in other words, why am I stressing this so much, right? Because there are some postmodern thinkers who believe that they, in essence, can just say anything. And if you want to say that they're wrong, then they're going to say, that's okay, it's a fruitful misunderstanding. I've even come across some of these thinkers who say things like, we don't believe in a master discourse, right? Or, I mean, this is this idea of like a meta-narrative in postmodernism, right? So since we don't believe in a master discourse, we don't believe that any discourse is right or wrong, right? We don't believe in thinking that somebody is right and somebody else is wrong. But I mean, it should be obvious that collapses under its own weight, right? The idea, and it's not immediately clear, in my opinion, that suggesting that one idea or one discourse is better than another discourse, it's not immediately clear that suggests that you advocate for master discourses. I mean, I don't think that this idea of a master discourse of a master even comes into play necessarily. I think that what's happening in that context, at least, is that you have people who want to suggest that they're all operating in the same paradigm. For example, let's just call it a psychoanalytic paradigm. So they want to claim that they're all operating in the same paradigm, and yet they disagree in regard to WMPFSSs, right? They disagree as to what counts as a problem. They disagree as to how, if anything counts as a problem, then how it can be solved. They disagree as to what certain fundamental concepts and terms mean. So they disagree, for example, in terms of worldview. I think they also aren't even clear in regard to what their method actually is. And so, but yet they want to be politically aligned with each other. And so despite the fact that they explicitly disagree with each other, they want to say, oh, well, that's okay. We don't have to consider one of us right and one of us wrong because we both claim to like the same stuff. So as long as we both like the same stuff, then we're going to say we're in the same paradigm with each other. And, you know, to give that a charitable reading, we could say something like, maybe they're attempting to have agreement in worldview. But it seems to me that if you disagree in regard to your problem field, if you disagree in regard to your standards of solution, and if you don't understand the method that essentially constitutes your paradigm, then it seems to me that you can't be certain that you're even operating in the same paradigm. I don't even think that they understand that they're operating within a paradigm. The point being is that theories come in paradigms, and paradigms can be incommensurable. For example, we now know that the Earth revolves around the sun. So for someone to say that, well, they can misunderstand the Ptolemaic paradigm all they want, and that these are fruitful misunderstandings, that there's some kind of really valuable stuff can come out of this. The idea is that maybe as some kind of historical novelty, but in reality, you know, they're not really advancing the theory at all. In reality, you know, they're stuck in a paradigm that has been shown to have incorrect methods, incorrect problem fields, an incorrect worldview, and incorrect standards of solution. So, you know, if they want to continue to operate in an incorrect paradigm, you know, for the sake of popularity or something like that. That's postmodernism, So anyway, we'll keep moving. This can be understood with or without invoking the normal scientific tradition paradigm. I think that's important because, again, they don't even have agreement in forms of life, if you want to think of it that way. I mean, or maybe they have their agreement in form of life is their disloyalty to truth and disloyalty to falsehood. In other words, if we are comparing two theories, we need to consider whether those theories stem from paradigms that are incommensurable with one another. And remember, incommensurability means mutual exclusivity. So if you are a Freudian psychoanalyst and you thereby, I think I use this example, I used to use this example all the time whenever I was teaching the history and systems of psychology, because it's such a clear, it becomes immediately clear the value of understanding incommensurability. So if you are a Freudian psychoanalyst and you thereby adhere to the method of being a blank slate, so as to not provoke a transference in the analysand or the patient, however you want to refer to him. Then, if you later invoke a different method, even if you justify it by saying you are establishing rapport, you have shifted between the WMPFSS of one paradigm, Freudian psychoanalysis, with those of an incommensurable paradigm, humanistic existential. So, the point is that if it is a legitimate problem from within the paradigm of Freudian psychoanalysis, if the provocation of transference is a legitimate problem, then even though you use justification of establishing rapport from a different paradigm, and so there is some justification out there for what you're doing, it's still the case that you have now gone against, you are now operating with an incommensurable problem field, right? So if you ask the humanistic existential therapists, they're going to say, as I'm quoting Carl Rogers here, that they're not concerned with transference. Fritz Perls among them, that this is just, it's unnecessary. It's not something to be concerned with. So there is not going to be any agreement between the psychoanalytic paradigm and the humanistic existential paradigm. When we talk about existential psychoanalysis, there is a sense in which we are shifting over to, notice they don't call it psychoanalytic existentialism. They call it existential psychoanalysis. We are shifting over to the existential paradigm and then attempting to articulate what we found beneficial from the psychoanalytic paradigm in terms of the WMPFS of the existential paradigm. Or, if we want to get really, well, we'll just leave it at that. We'll leave it at that. I don't want this to become too complicated. So what I'm saying here is that this is a reality of theorizing. It is a reality of thinking. And it's too often I find it to be the case that what happens is you do get these groups of people who agree with each other politically, and then they want to advance their politics, and they like each other so much that they feel like they can't disagree with each other. And so then what you end up in this situation where they just feel as though it's just a free-for-all, and the only thing that matters is popularity. But as we saw in the seminar on postmodernism, that's tyranny, right? That is the authoritarian anti-authoritarianism, right? That is a meta-narrative that has, suggests that it has incredulity toward meta-narratives. To be eclectic, then, is to mix and match WMPFSSs. However, incommensurable WMPFSSs cannot be combined. Can you imagine? This would be like talking to one of these scientists who says, well, it just depends on, how I feel. Sometimes I believe the earth revolves around the sun, and sometimes I believe the sun revolves around the earth. It's like, well, if that's true, it sounds like you're confused. It sounds like you don't actually know what's going on, right? So notice that the power of finding these points of incommensurability. So I think that it is possible to be eclectic, but when you are being eclectic, what you're really doing is you're still operating within a paradigm. Notice then, for example, you cannot say, I consider both the geo and the heliocentric paradigms to be true. Okay. All right. I really think that understanding paradigms and paradigm shifts is a powerful criteriological tool. If there's anything about this that didn't make any sense, maybe drop some questions in the comments and I can try to put something else together to be clear or to clarify. I know that feels like it was a short one, but that's probably a good thing. So thank you so much for being here. Please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.